Starbucks and Howard Schultz is not the story about coffee. It's a story about a man who refused to take no for an answer and a list that, if you can apply to your life, will change it forever. Think about the last time you had an idea you believed in, like really believed in. You told someone about it, maybe a few people, and they looked at you the way people might look at someone who is trying to grow a second head. So you softened it, or you shelved it, or you told yourself it needed more time. And that feeling, that specific combination of embarrassment and doubt, is the thing that has ended more careers than failure ever has. Howard Schultz felt it 217 times in a single year, but he still built a $100 billion company. Howard D. Schultz was born on July 19th, 1953 in Canarsie, Brooklyn, New York. His family lived in a public housing project. His father was a truck driver who injured his ankle on the job and got fired. No workers' comp, no health insurance, nothing. He watched his father come home in a cast, sit down on the couch, and have nothing. That image never left him. And not because it made him sad, it actually made him terrified. His father wasn't lazy. His father wasn't stupid. His father worked hard his entire life, and it still wasn't enough because he never owned anything. He was always one bad day away from losing everything. And when that bad day came, there was nothing to hold on to. Schultz decided early that he would never be in that position. He didn't know what that meant yet. He just knew that he needed to build something nobody could take from him. He got a football scholarship out of high school, graduated from Northern Michigan University in 1975, and then went to work at Xerox, where he made cold calls every single day. Every floor of every office building in Midtown Manhattan, starting at the top and working his way down. He got told no by every single receptionist, ignored by every manager, and turned away by enough people in a single week that most people would have quit the job. But not him. He stayed 3 years, and not because he loved it, but because he was learning something specific. That rejection did not mean stop, it meant next. He heard no enough times, and it stopped feeling like information about his idea and started feeling like a feature of the job. He got a performance review of 3 out of 5 and then quit, and not because the rejection broke him, but because he realized he was getting good at selling someone else's product, and he didn't want to waste that on a photocopier. In 1979, he went to work for a Swedish kitchenware company called Hammerplast as their U.S. general manager. Real responsibility this time, real accounts, and in that job, he developed something that would matter more than anything else in his career, really. An eye for the thing that didn't fit the pattern. In 1981, something started to bother him. There was a small coffee roaster in Seattle called Starbucks Coffee, Tea, and Spice. Just 5 stores. No presence outside the Pacific Northwest, no advertising, no profile, but they were ordering more Hammerplast drip filters than Macy's. More than any department store in his street, a tiny operation nobody had ever heard of was outpacing the biggest retail accounts he had, and nobody at Hammerplast seemed to think that was worth looking into. But Schultz was different. He couldn't let it go. So he flew to Seattle to see what was going on, and that store, Starbucks Coffee, Tea, and Spice, was tucked inside Pike Place Market. He walked in and stood there for what seemed like an eternity. The store sold whole beans, spices, equipment, but no beverages. Nothing to drink on the spot, but the founders, Jerry Baldwin and Gordon Bowker, talked about coffee the way other people talked about wine. The origin, the roast, the difference between one bean and another. There was a seriousness to the place that Schultz had never seen applied to something this simple, and he needed to work there. Not wanted, needed. The same way you feel when you find the thing you were supposed to be doing and realize that you've been doing everything else. He quit Hammerplast and hounded the founders of Starbucks until they hired him. In 1982, Howard Schultz became Starbucks Director of Retail Operations and Marketing. By then, the company had 4 stores, all in Seattle. They sold beans, and that was kind of it. And Schultz thought that was a problem that he could fix. A year later, in 1983, Schultz went to Milan for a houseware trade show. The trade show itself was unremarkable, but what happened on the walk to and from it was anything but. Every morning, every afternoon, and every evening, on his way through the city, he stopped at an espresso bar, and then another one, and then another one. And not because he had planned to, but because he couldn't stop. Milan had roughly 1,500 espresso bars at the time, and everyone he walked into felt like the same kind of revelation. Small rooms, a barista who knew every customer by name, espresso pulled by hand, Italian opera in the background, people standing at the counter who didn't seem to want to leave, not because they had nowhere to be, but because this was somewhere worth being. He spent an entire week going back and forth between the trade show and these bars, watching, taking notes. By the time he sat down on the plane, he was so full of what he'd seen he could barely contain it. This is the thing that Starbucks should be. Not a shop that sold beans you take home, but a place you come to, an experience, a place that was yours in the middle of the day between everything else. He couldn't wait to get off that plane. This is the moment you need to understand, because what Schultz felt on that plane is the same thing you've felt. You see something, you understand something, and you know, not hope, you know that it's right. And then you land and you tell someone and they look at you like you don't quite understand how the world works. He walked into the Starbucks offices and told the founders they need to be in the beverage business. He said he had seen the future, and they said no. They were a roaster. That's what they did. They didn't want to be in the restaurant business. So he kept pushing for 2 years. They finally let him open a small espresso counter inside one store on the corner of 4th and Spring in Seattle. It did 500 customers a week, more foot traffic than any Starbucks location had been averaging. He ran it himself, staying behind the counter, pulling shots, watching how people responded to having a place that felt like the bars in Milan. The founders watched the numbers and still said no. What he was describing wasn't what Starbucks was. So in 1985, Schultz left. He had watched his father stay too long in jobs that weren't going anywhere, and he wasn't going to make the same mistake. He started his own company. He named it Il Giornale after a daily newspaper published in Milan because that's what those bars had felt like, something that you came back to, part of the rhythm of a day. He did need $1.6 million to open his first store, though, and so he started calling investors. He called 242 people. The Italian espresso companies, Fema and Lavazza, both said no. They told him Americans would never pay for espresso. Goldman Sachs passed. Local investors, when Schultz described the concept, a small store, a trained barista, a coffee that cost more than anyone was willing to pay, looked at him like he was describing something from another planet, which for 1985 America, he basically was. 217 of those people said no. 217 of 242, 90%. Here's what that number actually means. It means that for every 10 people Schultz called, 9 of them told him he was wrong, that he couldn't do it, that his idea wasn't good enough. And this is maybe where you're at. You've had the first few calls and you start to wonder if maybe you're doing the right thing. Maybe the idea isn't as good as you thought. Maybe you're the one who doesn't understand how the world works. But Schultz had spent 3 years at Xerox, hearing no every single day from strangers. And he had learned something that most people never figure out, that no is almost never about the idea. It's about whether the person in front of you can see what you see. Most of them can't, and that's not a reason to stop. That's just the nature of the call. So what he did was he wrote every name down, all of them, and then he kept the list. He opened his first Il Giornale in April 1986. The line went out the door. He opened 2 more. He added seating because customers wanted to stay. He took the opera music off, the speakers because there were too many complaints. He learned, he adapted. He paid attention to every piece of feedback, even when he didn't agree with it, because the thing he was building was bigger than his preferences. In 1987, the original Starbucks founders decided to sell. They had overextended themselves acquiring Peet's Coffee down in the Bay Area, taken on too much debt, and now they needed out. They offered Schultz the first right to buy. The price, $3.8 million. Schultz didn't have it, so he went looking. While he was out looking for investors to buy, one of the people already on his table was quietly negotiating to buy Starbucks himself, a Seattle titan, someone with money and connection and zero interest in having Schultz in the equation. He wanted to cut Schultz out entirely, install his own management, and run it without the man who had the vision for what it could become. Schultz found out and had the kind of panic that makes it hard to think. He was in a basketball league with a young attorney named Scott Greenberg, whose firm was one of the most respected in Seattle, so he told him the whole story in the locker room after a game. Greenberg brought him in the next morning to meet the firm's senior partner. That partner was Bill Gates Sr., father of the man who was quietly building Microsoft a few miles away. Gates Sr. was 6'7" and built like a tank. He sat across from Schultz and asked 2 questions. Is everything you've told me true? Yes. Have you left anything out? No. And then Gates stood up and said, let's take a walk. They crossed the street to the office building where the man trying to steal the deal had his office. They rode the elevator up. Gates walked in, stood over the man's desk and said, Howard Schultz is going to acquire Starbucks Coffee Company, and you are never going to hear from him again. Are we clear? And that was the entire meeting. Bill Gates Sr. and his son helped Schultz finalize the investment. In August 1987, Schultz acquired Starbucks for $3.8 million. He merged it with Il Giornale, renamed everything under the Starbucks name, inherited 6 stores, and started running. By 1992, Starbucks went public. The IPO raised $271 million. Schultz used the capital to double the store count and then doubled it again. He chose the first 500 locations himself, driving the streets, counting foot traffic by hand. Every store turned profitable inside of 2 years, sometimes faster. 80% gross margins on a cup of espresso. Customers coming in 17, 18 times a month. Not every quarter, by the way, every month. By 1996, Frappuccino was 7% of total revenue. He took the bottled version of it to Coke, That meeting lasted under 30 minutes, and Coke said no. But we know how he handles no. He flew straight to Pepsi the same day and shook hands with the president there, building a joint venture that became a multi-billion-dollar business. By 2000, Starbucks had 3,500 stores across America, a global footprint expanding into Japan and China, and a brand that had put the word barista into everyday English, and a stock price that made a lot of people a great deal of money. Schultz stepped down as CEO. He was exhausted. He was confident in his successor. And that's where things start to go downhill. The men who followed him knew how to open stores. They were very good at that. Revenue doubled every 3 years. The stock climbed. By the mid 2000s, there were more than 13,000 stores worldwide, and the company was opening new ones so fast that in some neighborhoods, two locations sat across the street from each other, competing for the same customers. But something was happening underneath those numbers. The original espresso machines required trained baristas. You could hear the difference between a shot pulled correctly and one pulled badly. In 2000, the company switched to fully automatic machines. Push a button, get an espresso. Nobody had to know anything anymore. Then, Starbucks started adding food. Hot breakfast sandwiches that filled the stores with the smell of eggs and cheese instead of coffee. CDs. Even some sponsored films. The seating shifted to be corporate and cold, designed to move people through faster, to convert the destination Schultz had built into something closer to a drive-through you just happened to sit inside. The thing that had made Starbucks worth going to was being traded away, one small decision at a time, for a slightly better quarterly number. Japan felt it first. The stock price in their largest international market fell 50% as customers who had come in for the experience started going back to places where someone still cared about the shot. In 2007, Schultz wrote a memo to the company's senior leadership. It was not supposed to be made public. In it, he said the decisions made since he had left stripped the stores of their soul, that the automatic machines had eliminated the romance of the craft, that the chain had started to feel like a commodity. He called it the watering down of the Starbucks experience. The memo leaked. It ran in the Wall Street Journal. Management did not change course, though. They kept expanding. Then, 2008 arrived. The financial crisis hit. Consumer spending collapsed almost overnight. Same-store sales turned negative. That had never happened in Starbucks history. Not a single quarter since the company went public. Not once. Starbucks was suddenly 7 months away from insolvency. Schultz came back as CEO on January 7th, 2008. He flew 10,000 store managers to New Orleans, which was still rebuilding from Hurricane Katrina, and stood in front of all of them and told them exactly how bad it was. He apologized. He said they had let people down. Then he closed 600 stores and laid off more than 12,000 employees. Then he did something that made every financial analyst covering the company think he had lost his mind. On February 26, 2008, at 5:30 in the evening, Schultz shut down all 7,100 U.S. Starbucks locations simultaneously. Every one. For 3 hours. He pulled every barista in the country off the floor to retrain them manually on how to pull an espresso shot, not with a button, but with their hands, the way the baristas in Milan had done it in 1983 when he couldn't stop walking from bar to bar. The shutdown cost an estimated $6 million in lost revenue for a single evening. He didn't care. When reporters asked why, he said the company had convinced itself that a new flavor of Frappuccino was innovation. He said that is not innovation. By the end of 2010, net income had tripled from $350 million to $945 million. In 2 years, the stock recovered. The stores recovered. He had rescued a company 7 months from collapse by forcing it back to the thing he had seen in Milan in 1983, the thing that 217 people had told him that nobody wanted. The kid who had watched his father sit down on that couch built something nobody could take from him. And when people running it started giving away piece by piece, he came back to take it all. And he still has that list, by the way, all 217 names. He never threw it away because he said that every single no made him more certain that he was right. So when are you going to start your list?